Hello, everyone. You're listening to the Paradigm Shifts podcast with your host, Keisha Kruger. I'm an organization development practitioner and executive coach, working with leaders to create positive changes in the workplace using behavioral science. My personal mission? Share science-based tools and leadership insights from the field that you can use in the workplace and beyond. Considering we spend about 3/4 of our lifetime at work, there is incredible science and organizational psychology that can be used to rethink the way we work, lead, and ultimately live. Join me as I speak with thought leaders and business leaders in practice, unpacking lightbulb moments for paradigm shifts. Hello, everyone. I am so excited to share this week's episode with you. I had the opportunity to chat with Mckendree Hickory. She is the Head of Facilitation at Lifelabs Learning, supports the development and direction of their facilitation team. She has a PhD in industrial organizational psychology with a research focus on conviction, women's leadership development, and development experiences in the workplace. She has delivered leadership training at over 300 companies and led learning and development at the fully remote company InVision. For more information about Mckendree or the company Lifelabs Learning, be sure to visit the show notes. Hi, Mckendree. How are you?
I am doing well. I'm excited to be here.
Well, thank you for being here because I have a couple of questions for you. And it's around conversations that I've had with some of my colleagues and some of my friends. And it's around this idea of time management and productivity. If I'm walking by someone, either it's in the workplace or out on the street, I'm asking the question, how are you? I think that's pretty common. Typically, I get a response that's like, busy. It's like their general response. I'd say 7 out of 10 times that's the response I get. And sometimes that can feel a little overplayed. So in the workplace, is that just another way for employees to say that they're burnt out?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm I'm like immediately laughing because I'm thinking of a grad school advisor I had who often said, "Busy is boring. Tell me something interesting," and that really has like stuck with me throughout my career. Of one, just like actually say something more interesting, but two, I think you raise a really interesting question of essentially like what do we mean by busy? And one of the first thing that stands out to me when somebody says they're busy, like I can't not go to like the management leadership lens and really want to understand like, well, what do you mean by that? So one of the key things that we talk about at Lifelabs is this concept of deblurring and essentially like getting people to be specific with what they mean. And so if somebody tells me they're busy, my immediate question is like, what does busy mean to you? Because it could be, I literally have too many things to get done, right? It might be that like I'm bored, so I'm just filling my time with things, right? It might mean that there's too many competing priorities, and I'm not sure which one to focus on. So I think like actually getting people to define what they mean is kind of an interesting way to respond to that, and then to assess. Like it could be burnout, it could be overwhelm, but it might be something different. I also think there's probably. Oh, go ahead.
I love that concept of deblur. Can you tell me a little bit more about that? Because we use a lot of language, or you kind of just like fall onto language that's just common or just something that we're in a habitual use of. So tell me a bit more about deblur and like how we could apply that in other ways.
Yes. It's truly like one of the most useful skills I've ever learned, like from a workplace, but then can apply in life. So when we say deblur, again, this idea of getting specific with what we mean, and I'll share even just like 3 places it shows up. So one shows up often in feedback conversations. Could show up in a like, hey, you're doing great. Okay, cool. Right. But what is it that I'm doing that's actually effective? How might I continue to be a good performer? So it shows up in a context around feedback where we're giving feedback either positive or constructive that's not actually useful. It shows up all the time in time management. Some of my favorite examples, is you get something, get a response from someone or like, great, I'll get that to you ASAP. Cool, right?
What does that mean?
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Like I'm expecting in an hour, but depending on your day, you might be looking at the next month. And so the specificity of time language is something that I think about a lot. It even shows up when we start to think about like inclusion. I think about like an interview context is a really great example of doing a interview debrief. And if somebody's like, I don't know, I had a hard time connecting with that candidate and being like, great, what do you mean by that? So this idea of deblur shows up in a lot of different ways and why it is like such a useful skill to get really good at.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I was viewing a colleague's calendar to try to find like a time that I can set up a meeting with them, and I'm using Outlook like most companies do, and I don't have the details of that person's calendar, but I could see just the time blocks, right? And
Hmm.
what's interesting is in those time blocks, it was labeled busy. And
Hmm.
so it's like, wow, like, are we like, is technology informing us, or are we just, catching on? I don't know. But it just seems overplayed, and that really does help. And so other deblur words that could deblur can help with is like great, busy, fine, good. And then you said ASAP, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I think time language in general. So
Time
ASAP,
language.
end of day, any of those ones, because that really does. It sounds like casual, not that big of a deal, but it has pretty big implications for timelines and interdependencies and productivity. But
Mm,
again, I think it comes up all the time around conversations around
huge.
productivity, whether it is like I'm too busy, or even conversation on people's development or how they feel about their job. Like I just don't feel engaged. Okay, right. What does that
What
mean
does
to you?
that
What does it
mean?
look like? So yeah, far sweeping. It'll ruin pretty much most adjectives because now you're like, well, what do you mean by
I know, and
that?
I'm in adjective overload. It's like so important for defining expectations.
Hmm.
If I'm overwhelmed, I might say I'm overwhelmed to my boss, but like that's not going to help them help me
Yep.
uh, take off things off my plate, or just help me reorganize or reprioritize if I'm in that space, right? Because so deblurring our words is going to help us help ourselves in a lot of ways.
Mhm. Mhm.
Mm,
Yeah, and I think then it's so powerful. Like so often, I'm in a position to, train employees who are recipients of their manager saying, "Here are our priorities," or "Here's the work that I should do," and they feel overwhelmed. But they often struggle with having that specific language to get the support that they actually need. And so, if you come to me one of my employees and say, "Hey, I'm feeling overwhelmed. I'm feeling busy," I can't help you, right? But if you come
yeah,
in and you say, "Hey, I've noticed in the past like month, we've had switching priorities that just really impacted my ability to plan my days effectively and get the most important things done." Right? That's a radically different conversation than like I'm
yeah,
feeling busy and then I'm just like, cool, we're all busy, get back to it. And so,
yeah.
yeah, so much more
I,
advocacy can happen.
Yeah, I feel like deblurring can like solve so many problems in the workplace.
It's our
And then like,
tagline at life. Yeah, life's most useful skills.
yeah, like we can go home now. All right, we've just solved the world's problem.
Perfect.
Thank
Perfect.
you.
You're welcome.
So you talked a lot about time-based language, and so I want
Mhm.
to. That's a good segue into time management
Yep.
challenges. And uh, managers are often struggling with time management and how to prioritize. So, what are the top ways for managers to diagnose their time management challenges? But also, how can they diagnose their direct reports challenges? Because I imagine that kind of goes downstream. Whatever challenges they're having will have a downstream impact.
Yeah, I'm my ears perk up when you say diagnose because that's
Ugh,
literally where we start when we are partnering with organizations teaching these skills is like before we get into tools and tips on how to manage your day, let's actually diagnose the right problem. And so
mm,
I'll share that at least from the research that we've done at Lifelabs and working with, hundreds, thousands of organizations at this point, we've really been able to find that most time management challenges fall into four different buckets. Bucket one is a chronemics issue. And so the idea that we don't know about the time that we're using. A second one is really on prioritization. So, of all the things to do, which ones should I actually get done? Organization is a really interesting one. So people aren't organized well. And then finally, not surprisingly, is a sense of focus.
mm,
So helping managers diagnose, that would be a starting point for me, is to get really clear first on like, where's the root of this problem coming from? Is it that you are unclear of what the priorities are? Or is it that we actually don't know how much time it takes to get a task done? Is it a fact that we're not writing things down and capturing them well? Or is it I know exactly how much time I need. I know exactly what I should be focusing on. And hey, I'm getting interrupted too much to actually accomplish that task. So that'd be the first place I would say to actually start diagnosing. And then from there, you can get really tactical. And I've got tons of tools that I'm happy to share if that's helpful, but there's lots
yeah.
of tips you can do. But I think diagnosing and having a conversation is the first step to actually then figure out the right solution.
So that should be the first step, no matter what, is figuring out what's the root of the time management issue or that
Hmm.
challenge. So when it comes to the number three, I think you said organization, would that
Yeah.
be related to like the systems that you have in place to help you become organized, whether it's like uh, tools that you use or some sort of process that you're kind of leaning on to help you organize? Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. And so
Okay.
one of the ways, like a consistent capture system. And so
Okay.
I like to say, like, I don't care what system you use. I still take, pen and paper notes because that's the most like brain friendly to me. That wouldn't
Hmm.
work for a lot of people. And really just to speak to the kind of why are we doing this? One of the things that we're overcoming is something called the Zeigarnik effect. And this idea that we have all these open loops in our brain that end up distracting us. Great example, you wake up at 2 in the morning and you have that like, oh crap, like I totally forgot to call mom, or like, oh,
Oh
I
my
meant to
gosh.
like go pick that thing up. It's an open loop. We didn't write it down. And so your brain's going to do everything it can to say, hey, remember there was something you're supposed to do. So a simple fix is just having that consistent capture system, be more organized, and you can actually like
Mm.
remember what you need to accomplish.
Yeah, and like have a way to brain dump those things
Exactly.
into somewhere. It's interesting because I was doing that intuitively. I started placing a notebook next to my bed when I wake up in the morning, kind of just having
Hmm.
a place, or if I wake up in the middle of the night, having a place to write things down. But I mean, how much is social media impacting this Zeigarnik effect, or how much is that impacting our ability to really have this sense of focus when we're constantly being pulled in different directions with all the tech that we're using and then the social media challenges, the pages that we're on? I mean, you can be on like seven places now: LinkedIn,
Hmm.
Facebook, Instagram. How is that impacting our ability to focus?
Yeah. I mean, in so many ways. I think that my brain immediately went to like in three immediate ways come to mind. I mean, one is just like the pure distraction nature of it.
Mm,
So I did the calendar block, I put busy, but whatever it is, I'm working on something important and my phone starts buzzing, right? I got a
mm,
new follower. That wouldn't be my problem. I don't have many followers, but there's something that distracts you.
yeah.
And now that notification has taken my attention away. In fact, I was actually not too long ago, I was reading a really interesting research study, and they were studying the impact this had even on people driving. And even if you don't
Ugh,
even answer the call, you don't even look at the notification, the mere presence of it distracts you from what you're doing. And so
yeah.
notifications, like the pure tech side of that, really disruptive.
Not to
Go
interrupt
ahead.
you, but
No, please.
I literally started putting my phone on do not disturb, and the difference that has made just mentally feeling like I can focus on the things that in front of me. Because you're right, we'll get like an email and then it'll buzz, and it doesn't even have to be a ring. You can have your phone on silent, but you just hear that buzz, and our brains automatically associate it with, okay, it could be important, or it should, it's something we need to check. So it's like
Hmm.
constant notifications everywhere, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And the research on it is really interesting too, that the distraction takes your focus away, and you may still complete your task that you're working on, and you might even actually complete it a little bit
Mm,
faster because now there's more like time pressure because you've allowed yourself to get distracted. But you do so at the rate of increasing your stress, increasing your frustration, increasing the pressure you feel. Right now you have less time to get something done. And so there's the notification side of it. I think there's also like a neurological kind of the brain science side of this. So I just think of the quick, easy hit of dopamine that you get from checking a notification. And I know for me, I hate starting things from scratch. Like that is the more challenging task in my work life, is to have to create something new. And so you better believe I'm looking for every opportunity to be distracted because it doesn't feel nearly as good as like looking at a cool picture from somebody. So I think
yeah.
there's that side of it too. There's like a craving that we have built in with social media and with constant ability to get that dopamine hit, that we might seek it out in times that work feels a little bit harder. So it also, I think, can distract us in that way too.
Do you think we've leaned on social media for connection and belonging, and in the lack of having that like proximity to individuals through COVID and through the pandemic? Do you think that
Hmm.
might be like pushing us more towards that? I mean, I know that we get the dopamine from the notifications like you'd mentioned, but I'm just curious, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Probably, I'm sure in some ways. I'm also mindful of, for a lot of people, the remote work, distributed work, the constant Zoom calls is super fatiguing. And so
Mm.
I think there is a desire to escape in some ways from that. But yeah, I'm sure there is a study on it that I have not read, but I do think there is absolutely a craving for connection and belonging, regardless of the context that we're in. And social media has created an opportunity for that, that a lot of people are seeking out.
Mm. And then you said there was three things. So what was the third one?
Third bucket was also just, I think there's a piece of, right, the fear of missing out, or the
Mm.
organizational culture that exists, right? So many times I have trained managers and leaders in these skills, and some of the pushback can be, that's just not our culture, right? We have to be on all the time. My job requires me to be constantly checking these things. And I think those are positions where we have to pretty much ask people, like, oh, it sounds like there's a choice to be made. And to
Mm.
me, I'm not about making sure somebody does the right thing necessarily. I want you to know that you are making a choice. And so there's a choice to check your email constantly. There's a choice not to do that. If you do work in a particular field or role that requires that, then how might we reorient how you think about those tasks to say, okay, this is my work, and I keep my inbox open all the time so that it's meeting my expectation versus it's this interruption that I can't get away from. So I think it's all about having clarity of, like, what is my role, and then orienting yourself to that versus it will constantly feel like a distraction and a frustration for a lot of people.
Oh, the choice to be made. That's so powerful because we do have choices in all of these things.
Mm-hmm.
Culturally, in an organization, getting leaders to shift on that could take some time, right? In terms of like always on. But you also mentioned the time pressure thing, going back to that. There's a difference between a time pressure and a healthy time pressure. So it gives you some pressure to get things done a little bit quicker, but at the expense of our health, our well
Mm-hmm.
being, potentially, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And we look at, I mean, it's one of the number one reasons people are leaving organizations is a toxic culture, a place where well-being is not part of it. And I think so often the way we try to solve for that is, more benefits or perhaps more PTO, which huge fan of. We should continue to do that. However, we have to look at the context of the work that people are doing every day.
Yeah.
And I think this is where leaders are critical role models. I was just having a conversation with a team member a couple weeks ago who's newer to the team and was like, "Hey, I'm going to be on vacation, but I'll check in." And I said, "Don't." And if you
Yeah.
do, I won't respond to you because I don't want to reinforce that that is something that you should have to do.
Hmm.
And so I think also is how are you modeling? Because so often people say, check out after 6 p.m. and then they're the same people emailing you at 9 p.m.
Yeah, when I've done research on boundaries in psychology and a
Mm-hmm.
lot of expressions around you teach people how you want to be treated, right? So you are, in essence, enabling that behavior. So if you do not want that behavior to continue, if you're a leader and you've got employees who are doing those things and you don't want them to, you want them to take charge of rest, that you want them to recover, you really want them to take a step back and really um, recharge their batteries, then what are you doing as a leader to model that behavior? And
Mm-hmm.
vice versa, what are you doing to contribute to that culture, right? And perpetuate it in a sense. And there's a lot of self-awareness that goes into that, or that's needed at a leadership level, I imagine, right?
Oh, absolutely. And I think, and yes. And I think too, recognizing that those leaders also need to be given permission that that's okay too. And I think that
Yeah.
that's where productivity, it's not just about managing the time of our day. It rolls up to the biggest questions of what is our business strategy and what is the culture of the organization that we're creating. And I think if we miss that component of it, we miss the opportunity to then align consistently through the organization. And so I think for leaders, if they are struggling with that, that's a conversation they need to be having at that executive level to say, okay, what is getting in the way of us doing that?
Yeah.
And And again, if I were a startup founder, they know that they're stepping into something that's going to require this many hours from them. And like, again, it goes to me, it goes back to that choice and commitment. I'm choosing this. But if we're not giving people that choice, we're not making those expectations clear, then people just flounder and feel disengaged and tired and burn out, which you're losing your most valuable asset as an organization at that point.
Yeah, and I think of organizations where the culture is prevalent around being busy and staying busy. If you're not busy, then we're going to be busy trying to get busy, right? That
Mhm.
kind of thing. And
Sure.
so the pressure is really on multitasking, or at least that's implied. It's like, well, you only have so much time in a day. So, how do you get as much done as possible? And so we resort to multitasking. But I was doing some research and I had read a study, and it found that about 2.5% of people in the world can actually multitask. So
Hmm.
it's like a biological trait, I guess, that you have or you don't have. And so when it comes to multitasking, how can attempts at multitasking be harmful or counterproductive to our goals? It's not like, you win the lottery and you have that multitasking gene. It's a very small percentage of the population.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I would answer that in two ways. So I think first is also if we are an organization where people have to be busy for the sake of being busy, that raises so many questions for me around where are we not clear on what our priorities are? Where have we listed 7 priorities? And guess what? You can't focus on 7 things. So people don't actually know how to orient their day around the most important things. I
Mm.
also immediately question things around visibility of people's work, and are they getting recognized? Is there positive feedback? Because if there's a need to get really busy to show that I'm valuable, there's a whole lot of other things that are broken outside of
Oh, yeah.
the productivity side. More specifically, though, yes, on the multitasking, I don't have that gene, so I just need to know that. I think most of us don't have that clearly. If it's only 2.5%, I would speak to kind of what I was mentioning a little bit earlier, that we know it increases people's stress to attempt to do it. Typically, it increases people's error rate, and so like the type of work that you're not doing as effectively.
Mm.
And it also, I think, again, it disrupts us from focusing on the things that actually matter most. I think about even the idea of like a 45-minute meeting. Uh, and if people are multitasking through that whole meeting, it's like how this could have been a 15-minute meeting, likely, if people were actually focused during it. But so often I'm listening. I was giving somebody poking fun at them yesterday because you could tell who wasn't paying attention, because it's like every 12 seconds their body knows to like just nod, even though their eyes aren't even on the screen. They're doing
Yeah.
something different. It's just not helpful.
And how much time is wasted and how much knowledge is potentially missed in those meetings. Oh my goodness, there's a whole science of meetings. Hey everyone, I want to take just a quick break from this week's chat to tell you about something very exciting. It's something for those of you who listen to my podcast that train Brazilian Jiu Jitsu, and it's called BJJ Summer Week. So, what is it? Imagine participating in one of the biggest BJJ community camps in the world and training amongst hundreds of other BJJ practitioners. People coming from all around the world with the willingness to share their culture and their knowledge of BJJ with each other. That's what BJJ Summer Week is all about. It's 5 days of seminars, parties, excursions, incredible food, and more in the capital of the Mediterranean, Cagliari, Sardinia. And the next BJJ Summer Week is happening next year from September 20th to the 24th of 2023. If this is something you'd be interested in joining, there is an early bird special if you book now on www.bjjsummerweek.com. If you book by December 31st with the code Paradigm Shifts, you'll get a tatami gi for free. You have the right to cancel the camp before 30th of May for any reason. I'll be there. I'm so excited to go next year. I was there last year. So what are you waiting for? Get your BJJ friends together and start the planning. Book today. Join BJJ Summer Week. Now, let's get back to this week's chat. But the quality is diminished as well, like you had mentioned.
Mhm.
In terms of like people not knowing how to prioritize around what's most important, there's got to be some effective and efficient ways managers can use to prioritize their workload. Can you walk me through some that you're aware of?
Yeah. So first, and I've kind of said this a lot, but I think one is again knowing what the priorities at the organizational department and team level actually are. So before you can even figure out what should I accomplish today, I need to know what is the bigger vision. The reason that that matters is one, it ensures that people are working on the right things. Also, it gives a sense of meaning to our work. So if I'm just busy with random tasks, I don't know how they link up to something more important. It's really hard to feel motivated or to do really effective work because is it meaningless? I don't know. Nobody's told me. So I think the power of the link up is a really important one. From
Hmm.
there, I think there are a lot of tools that I like. There's a lot of love for the Matrix, the Eisenhower Matrix. Stephen Covey is really known for making it popular, and essentially that's mapping things that are urgent versus things that are important. If folks listen to the beginning of this podcast, your deblur feelers may have gone off because what does urgent mean? What does important mean? So my recommendation is if you use a tool like that, you as a team define what are urgent and important tasks. Otherwise, you can still get into a bit of a blurry space with that. The other thing that I think about, so on a really simple level, one of my favorite tips for daily focus around priorities is what we call our MITs, or most important things. And it's a really simple habit of essentially at the start of the day, right, looking at your calendar or looking at what you need to accomplish and write down what are the three MITs, right? If all else fails, these are the three most important things.
These are the three
What's
things I'm committing to completing by the end of the day, right?
Yes, either
Okay.
completing or making progress on, depending on the project that you're working on. What's
Mhm.
really cool about it, I'll never forget working with a consulting firm, and they adopted this habit individually but collectively as a team. And in the morning, everybody would put into the chat communication tool that they use, here are my three MITs for the day. And as a manager, that's super cool because you get this immediate visibility into what people are working on, and you get a real quick data point for, are people thinking about the right priorities? Because if people had a bunch of MITs that you're like, why is that an MIT? We can have a conversation about it. And this team went it so far as at the end of the day, they'd say the same thing. They'd say, these are the things that I got done. And then it created an opportunity for them to say, here's why I didn't get the other ones done. I got distracted, or this other competing priority came in. So it's this conversation that is surfacing all these data points that as a manager now you can more effectively figure out, okay, where do I need to help the team focus more or become less of a blocker on things. So I think that's one of my a really simple but really powerful habit that teams and individuals can leverage.
I love that, and 3 is not too much to focus on, I don't
Mm-mm.
think. I think that's just a good amount of items that you can really it's digestible, right? But it just in order to keep it visible and if things shift and priorities change over time or throughout the day, would you recommend like a co-authoring tool where that information is shared in real time, like in a Google Docs or like a Dropbox paper? Is that something that you'd recommend?
Yeah, and I mean, it probably depends on the nature of the work and like how interdependent is it. Like if it's a small
Mhm.
task that I own and nobody else is seeing it, like I don't know if I need to make that public, but for high stakes projects where there are a lot of moving pieces, absolutely, because it
Mhm.
allows then everybody else to plan accordingly. If your one I MIT unlocks mine, I can't get mine done until you get yours done, and so some shared information can be really cool there.
Oh my goodness. My mind is thinking about, like, all the ways I can utilize that.
Hmm.
Tell me can you share with me an example about linking up? Because I think that's such a valuable tool. How does that, like, look in the organization or in the workplace?
Yeah. So this is something we teach. We have a strategic thinking workshop, and this is something that it's like one of the primary tools and habits that we teach leaders of. Whenever communicating priorities, we have to be able to link it up. And so essentially what you are thinking about doing is think about like drawing a link up map. And so you take your small tactic. So if we were to use you for an example, let's say you were part of a large organization, right? Your task might be to create this podcast episode today,
Mhm,
but you need to be able then to start linking that up to understand, why does this matter? And right, it might
mhm,
matter because more podcast episodes are going to drive more customer interest, and more customer interest links up to our goal of X revenue dollars in the next month, or bringing in this many new clients over the next month, whatever those specific high level goals are. And so the power in that is that now perhaps you have more focus and motivation for this task because you have clarity on the
Mm.
overarching impact it's going to have. And so it's a really cool way. It's a language, I think, that allows us to drive motivation, to drive engagement in tasks, but also to ensure we're aligned on priorities. Because if you think the reason you're doing a podcast is to drive more customers, right, and somebody else is like, no, we want to drive more R&D. We want more people to come in and share things we're not in. That allows us to have a conversation now about where we might be misaligned on our priorities. So that'd be an example of the link up that, again, all of these things create more important conversations that allow us to actually figure out what we're trying to accomplish and where the gaps might be.
I mean, and it goes back to deblurring. Like you're deblurring at all levels, even when it comes to like
Mm-hmm.
what's motivating us and what's the bigger vision. How is this different than like an OKR methodology for goal setting? Or is it similar? It's just different contexts.
Yeah, I think similar. I get that question all the time. They're like, what's best, OKRs or KPIs and this and that? And my stance, and maybe it's a bit of a cop out sometimes, is like a tool is a tool. It's a matter of how you use it. And so if you have a team that is driven by OKRs, people are super clear on what we are trying to accomplish, how we get there, and how my work matters. Great. I am not tied to the language that you use. I am tied to, are you consistently applying it, and is it
Mm.
clear to everybody how to use the tool? So I think you can use them in smaller ways and larger ways, but it has to be the consistency of the application where you actually see a tool work.
Yeah, the framework and the model is not as important as how you use it. Okay.
Mhm.
Well, you're an IO psychologist, so of course, I'm going to ask you. There's got to be some good psychology that you can share with us about productivity or productivity challenges. Like, if there's psychology behind that, can you share what you know?
Yeah, totally. I mean, there's so much. I mean, one of my favorite, like, this is more playful than not, but when people are like, I have a hard time saying no, I'm like, cool. Tell me about your childhood and when you had to please people as a kid, like, because really, it's interesting how our individual psychology shows up in the workplace. But speaking more on the org level, again, brain goes to a couple different places. I think energy management is a really
Mm.
interesting place to explore when it comes to productivity issues. So we know that our brains, although there are 24 hours a day, not out every hour is created equal when it comes to productivity, and everybody is different. There are some trends that I'll share. One interesting trend is that for a majority of people, our brain is best in the morning for really deep thinking type of work. So focus work, strategic work, things that require us, creating things from scratch that really require a level of attention and energy and focus, we tend to be best at in the morning.
Mm.
Middle of the day is a great time to get your emails done. So, like more smaller task, administrative type tasks, things that don't take a ton of brain power. And then, interestingly enough, creative work tends to happen the best towards the end of the day. The reason that is hypothesized in that way is that our the judging parts of our brain are a little bit more tired at the end of the day, and so we tend to be less critical of our creative ideas. Whereas in the morning, we might be poking more holes into it. So I think that's a really interesting thing,
Wow.
both as an individual to figure out when am I at my best. And so often, back to the calendar block idea, somebody has a calendar block, for middle of the day when like maybe their brain sucks at the middle of the day. And like, how might I orient my actual calendar to the times where I'm going to get the most out of my brain and be way more productive with that 2 hours than I know for me, whenever I put a calendar block at the end of the day, I have to laugh at myself because I'm like, you are not going to do that. Don't put that there.
Oh my gosh, this changes everything. I'm doing it all wrong.
Should we end now and we can reconnect later for more creative spaces?
Yeah, and I'm just thinking like, oh my gosh, how do you like, let's say I wanna apply this
Mhm.
at my level as an individual, and I start blocking out, okay, this is my deep thinking time, this is my email time, this is my creative work time. How do you do that when you've got demands from people and like communicating that. Like, for example, in my role, I do have flexibility in my schedule. I am able to create like my own time, and I have a lot of autonomy. But if other people are expecting to hear from me at certain times, or they have projects that they're dependent on me from, like, how do I communicate those expectations?
Hmm. So two things. One, I think you nailed it with like communicate, right? It is
Mm,
literally getting into like communication. And just to be frank, right? This is where the ideal versus the reality exists. This really is problematic for, global teams, and they have time zones. And so it doesn't matter when my best time is, because I'm going to have to be in a meeting with somebody perhaps on the other side of the world. So
mm,
recognizing that all, I do think there are ways to communicate this. And so I think it again goes back to deblurring, being very specific with, hey, what would it look like to bump this team meeting back by 30 minutes? Here's the reason why I'm making this recommendation. And so making clear the request from people, and they might say no and it may not work, but we don't know until we've actually tried to communicate that. I'm a huge fan of experimentation. So especially if it's a bit of a smaller team, being willing to say, what would it look like to shift these? And let's just see what happens. Or what would it look like to make this meeting asynchronously? So those are some things on the experimentation side. I also think about having, trade-off conversations and that clarity. And so often people will say, "Hey, can you get this done?" And we say, "Yeah, sure, no problem." But you can make that 10% better by saying, I'm happy to get that done. Is it okay if I get that to you by 3 p.m. tomorrow? And so by suggesting that deadline, hopefully I've factored in what my schedule actually looks like, when my brain might be best, and when I can actually get it done. And a lot of times people will say yes. But we like essentially are like leaving money on the table by not making our own deadline, or at least making the request for
because
it.
we're making an assumption that if they're asking for it, it needs to be done right now, right?
Totally.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So that's one. I think trade-off conversations are really important too. And this is less about managing your schedule, but if somebody's like, "Hey, can you get this done?" Again, same thing, because we want to be helpful or please or whatever the intention is, we say yes. Versus saying, "Hey, I'm happy to get that done. Here are the two things that won't get done today if I accomplish that. Is this more important?" And so again, the
Mm.
specificity of that trade-off allows us to then focus in on, okay, what's the most important thing? And I know this as a manager, right? Something will pop into my head. I'm like, "Oh, I should have so and so do this." And I send an email, not realizing that I've just possibly reoriented that person's entire day for something that like was actually just an interesting idea I had, or something that I didn't need any action on until 2 weeks from now. And so the specificity of request, as well as like the questions we ask, make a huge difference.
We've started to push that a little bit in our organization, like the follow-ups. If you get requests in the communication or an email or a Teams message, follow up and ask, like, when do you need that by? And then be
Mhm.
willing to like do those trade-offs and say, I'm happy to get this done. Um, by this time, or this is what's not going to get done. We've been starting to work on that as an organization.
Yeah.
But I could just, in terms of like building out the calendar off of, like, I'm still stuck on that. I
Yeah.
imagine a whole company just saying, okay, this is what our philosophy is going to be on energy management. And from now on, this is, I know it's ideal versus realistic, but whew, that would be insane. So,
Yeah. And I've seen a lot of companies try that. I've seen companies try like no meetings days. I've actually seen it
yeah.
where this seems to have the best adoption is actually with engineering teams, software engineering teams, because they understand the importance of deep focus work more than a lot of other teams I've ever had exposure to. And so those are places where I have seen people say this is either a no meetings day or we don't do meetings before noon, because that leveraging the importance of that really matters. And I think it, even zooming out, it goes back to your management philosophy too, of
Mhm.
like, I personally don't care when you get your work done. And if your brain is honestly best at 11 p.m. at night, great. I won't be responding to you, but like do your work then if you want to like take the morning off. And so I think going to, do we care about somebody having their, status on their Zoom screen on at these particular hours, or do we actually care about the quality of the work getting done and being really clear about the timelines?
Yeah, and most times when you give the employee that flexibility and that autonomy, they are going to fulfill like the commitments in a better way, right? Their quality is probably going to be more because there's less pressure to do it the way that is outlined by the manager, and just more freedom to be able to do it the way that works for the individual.
Yeah. No, there's like 5 key drivers of engagement, and one of them is autonomy, right? One of them is a sense of progress. And so give me some autonomy to make my own progress. I typically going to be a relatively happy person, at least for that time period.
Absolutely. Well, we're actually wrapping up, and I can't believe the time
Yeah.
went by so quick, but I have one final question for you.
Mhm.
And I ask this of all of my guests, and it is, what is the most recent paradigm shift that you've experienced? And this can be related to the work you're doing or what you see on the horizon.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I've been thinking about this. I'm like, maybe it's like busy is boring. Like maybe I need to be more interesting. But I mean, I'm still very much what COVID and remote work, what COVID did to unlock remote work is just we are only scratching the surface of what the broader long term implications of that are going to be. And I think though specifically not just remote work, but the pairing of the unlock of remote work alongside a global healthcare pandemic has
Mm.
created so many more pressures on organizations when it comes to the well-being, to the care of employees, to the boundaries, to the benefits, that I think, again, we are only beginning to see the impact of. And I think each
Wow.
generation requires something different of organizations, and this has expedited what are now tickets to play as an organization and what they have to offer. So I'm excited to see how we adapt and, the challenges that will come. And that's what gives IO psychologists great job security over our
I know. And that just, oh my goodness. So, I mean, imagine 5 years down the road, organizations are training employees on setting boundaries. Like, imagine that's an incredible
Mhm.
place to be and something to look forward to. I want to thank you so much for your time. And
Welcome.
I look forward to keeping up with your journey. And I appreciate all of the good knowledge and psychology that you've been able to bring us today.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. It's always fun to get to just kind of nerd out on all of these really important topics.
Thank you. Thank you so much for tuning into this week's episode. If you enjoyed this conversation, don't forget to leave a review, rate, and subscribe wherever you're listening. If you know a business leader in practice or friend who you think would be interested in this episode, please consider sharing it with them. I am so grateful for your support. For more updates, you can follow us at Paradigm Shifts Podcast on Instagram. See you on the next episode.